What if everything you've been told about NASCAR history isn't wrong? It's just incomplete by design. You've been told the story of NASCAR, the champions, the legends, the ones who made it, but every story depends on who's telling it and who they leave out. If there's anything people who know me would agree on, it's that I love to tell stories. Some factual, some for entertainment value, but never with malice. So a few things we learned from the 2311 lawsuit, and something we all know and we've experienced, is NASCAR loves control. They love to control the narrative, and they're vindictive. You're either with them or against them, and they are not afraid of leveraging that against you. Historically, they have controlled their story. But when a story gets documented as history, it has to be accurate. Because when inaccurate stories become history, well, then that's a narrative. And that's what we've always had with NASCAR. Their history is a carefully crafted and controlled narrative. This series isn't about telling a better story. It's about correcting history. So let's see if we can find some common ground on this episode. Can we all agree that growing up on the West Coast and in the southeastern part of the United States was a vastly different experience? I'm not just talking about whether your ears are on the inside or the outside of your hat. But since we're trying to earn Dale Jr.'s trust, keep your friggin' ears on the outside of your hat. Can we agree that throughout history, events were happening on both coasts at the same time, and the lens we viewed them through was different? It was influenced by our parents, our families, and our access. What tracks we could get to, what tracks we visited, which drivers we actually saw. If you liked asphalt, if you liked dirt, stock cars, or open wheels. That wasn't just preference. That was exposure. So our different experiences and our different exposures can be told in different stories. Agreed? Because this isn't about whose version was better, whose dad was better, which driver was better, which coast was better. That's an entirely different debate. This is about acknowledging greatness. Greatness that has been locked out of the NASCAR history books and the NASCAR Hall of Fame for way too long. This is about seeing the full picture, the ones that were never developed or exposed. We have to ask NASCAR, why? Even if it started as an accident, maintaining it becomes a decision. At some point, not fixing the problem becomes the most intentional act of all. I'm less interested in what NASCAR meant to do and more interested in why they allowed it to happen. So the question now isn't about the past. It's about the future. It's about their intent. It's about the present. Do they have the willingness, the courage, the integrity to correct it? Not for anyone's personal agenda, but for the fans. The sport belongs to the fans. And it was those very fans that made NASCAR what it is today. It's for the families, the dads, the grandkids who lived the sport. And guess what? We lived it on the West Coast too. And NASCAR stole our history. So if NASCAR's skewed history has no malice, the correction of their history starts here, this ballot, this induction. If they choose not to correct their history, then that proves malice, that proves intent. And that further damages the sport. It all starts by going back to the beginning, to a time before NASCAR was national. Before their story was cleaned up, before their record was skewed, and the narrative, the controlled narrative, was wrongly turned into history. We need to go back to the people who were already there, the people that lived it. The ones at the tracks, the drivers, the ones who had control. The ones NASCAR had to go through just to get access. Because there were gatekeepers west of the Mississippi. And those same gatekeepers, they're the ones who let NASCAR into the West. They are the very ones now left outside of the history and the sport they helped build and create. This is where that story begins. This is Short Track Stories. The series is Encumbered. And this is episode 2, The Gatekeepers. Long before NASCAR had the power to do anything outside the Southeast, the West was already thriving. There weren't just tracks. There weren't just promoters. There wasn't just regional racing. There was a proven and thriving system. A real one. Much more elaborate, organized, and attended than anything NASCAR had at that time. And at the center of that system were 3 gatekeepers. The first was USAC. The second, J.C. Agajanian. And the third was Bob Barkheimer. They were in firm control of the West. These weren't side characters in NASCAR's story. These were the ones holding the keys. NASCAR didn't expand into the West. They were allowed into the West. They didn't build it from Daytona outward. They entered a system that already existed. One that was organized, competitive, and controlled by people who didn't answer to NASCAR. Agajanian and Barkheimer, they were promoters. They didn't care about a sanctioning body. They thought like business owners. And to them, NASCAR was nothing but inventory. More events equal more profits. So NASCAR didn't come west dictating any terms. They had no power. They had no leverage. To Agajanian and Barkheimer, could have been a traveling circus for all they cared. So NASCAR didn't conquer the West. The gatekeepers didn't let them in because they were weak. They opened the gates and let them in because they were strong enough to do so. They didn't believe they had to close NASCAR out. NASCAR didn't force their way in because, as I said, they had zero leverage. They were allowed in on terms that made total sense at the time to Barkheimer and Agajanian. Once they were inside, they changed the terms. That's why anyone who made stock car racing viable beyond the Southeast, they've been pushed to the margins of NASCAR's official history. Those same gatekeepers who once held the keys, they're the ones now locked outside the gates. And if you understand that, then you understand this isn't a missing chapter. It's a rewritten one. Because if NASCAR doesn't get through the gatekeepers, it fails. It remains a regional series. And USAC may have been sitting in NASCAR's seat, And if that makes you uncomfortable, if you don't believe it, you should, and it should. Because the same word NASCAR uses to marginalize the Winston West series, regional. The West had more tracks, more fans, more states. They covered more miles. They were the first to race international. They were the first to have international drivers. The West was the model. We've all been handed a version of regurgitated history that's clean, simple, and easy to believe. NASCAR started in the South. They grew, they expanded, and they became the center of American racing. That history, that version of history, is not only highly inaccurate, it's also skewed. It's encumbered. However, because NASCAR controlled the narrative, that's the version that stuck. That's the version that became history. But if you slow down and actually look at what was happening in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, not through the lens of today, rather what was actually happening in our country then, that version doesn't hold up. The farther we get from history, the easier it becomes to believe. This isn't about telling a better story. It's about correcting that history, exposing a history that has been documented through a very narrow lens. Because NASCAR didn't rise in a vacuum. And it didn't walk into the West as the dominant force we've been led to believe. We've been told a story. That stock car racing started in the Southeast and spread across the country like a rising tide. Daytona, France, NASCAR, and everything else that followed. That only works if you believe the story rather than researching the history. That works because before the internet, before people could do their own research, before people could fact check, I always tell my kids I was a much better race car driver before the internet was invented. And guess what? NASCAR had a much better story. So let's begin with USAC. USAC wasn't just another racing organization. They were the authority. Before NASCAR had national reach, USAC controlled some of the most prestigious racing in the country, including the biggest stages, the biggest drivers, and the deepest credibility in motorsports. They sanctioned races across disciplines, Indy cars, sprint cars, and yes, stock cars. The second gatekeeper was J.C. Agajanian. He was the man. He already had the infrastructure, he had the tracks, he had the crowds, he had all the events that mattered. He had influence with USAC, the most credible sanctioning body in the country at the time. Agajanian had ties to the biggest stage in American racing, the Indianapolis 500. He had relationships with drivers, with teams, with manufacturers. That's not influence. That's leverage. Because when you control the venues, when you control the events, when you control what gets promoted, who gets seen, you're not just participating in the sport. You decide who gets to operate in the sport. And when NASCAR came west, they didn't walk in with power. Like I said, they had no leverage. They walked into Agajanian's world. Here's the part that never gets told, the part that people miss. Agajanian, the West, they didn't need NASCAR. Agajanian, He already had racing that drew crowds, drivers that could compete, a system that functioned without Daytona. NASCAR needed Agajanian. So the question isn't why Agajanian didn't stop NASCAR. The question is, why did he let him in? He was in control of the gate. Opening the gate didn't mean he was giving up control. It meant he was adding value. More races, more drivers, more revenue. NASCAR wasn't seen as a threat. They were seen as another option, another participant. But that's what makes this moment so important. Because if Agajanian makes a different decision, if he aligns fully with USAC, if he keeps NASCAR at a distance, if he plays it out just a little longer, if he doesn't provide access to his venues, then NASCAR's expansion west, it doesn't look the same. It slows, it fragments. They struggle for legitimacy. And in this era, nothing was guaranteed. And that matters. Because this is before sponsorship was locked, before the structure was solidified, before the sport had an identity. Control was 100% still up for grabs. Agajanian didn't have to defeat NASCAR to change its future. He didn't have to outspin them. He didn't have to out-organize them. All he had to do was not open the gate. Next is the third gatekeeper and the most key component in NASCAR history. The one NASCAR history almost completely leaves out. We never hear of him. Bob "Barky" Barkheimer. Barkheimer didn't just run races. He had already built a system. He, not NASCAR, built the Division Series, the Pacific Coast Late Models. It was his division, a network that stretched west of the Mississippi through California and up into the Northwest. 10, 12, sometimes more tracks tied together in a traveling championship. Surrounding that, encompassing that, there were dozens of weekly tracks. 25, 30, sometimes more, just in California alone. Running weekly. He controlled all of it. 5,000, 10,000 people per show. 15, 20,000 for major events. That's a fan base. He had the infrastructure. Compare that to what NASCAR had at the time. 40, maybe 50 races a year, all in the Southeast, running the same 20 venues or so. I mean, it was strong, but it was contained. So when NASCAR history tells you it expanded west, what it doesn't tell you, it was stepping into a system that was already complete, thriving, it was functioning. The roadmap, the infrastructure, it was all already in place. The stars were in place. Now there's another part of history that almost nobody talks about. And it matters more than people realize. The West Coast was not the weaker market. That's the story people tell, but it's not the reality. Because when you look back at the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, we tend to look at it through today's map, through today's lens. But the country didn't look the same then. The South, the region NASCAR was built in, the region NASCAR was racing in, it was much smaller. It was less populated, less concentrated. California alone was exploding. Los Angeles was the largest media market in the country. And that doesn't count San Francisco, San Diego. They had massive population. They were under massive population growth. Seattle, way denser markets, more people, more fans, more potential fans. California alone was more populous than the entire southeastern states combined. The Southeast was still developing. They were much smaller cities, much more rural, and more spread out. So while NASCAR was drawing 15, 20,000 people in those markets, I mean, that was solid. That was strong. But it wasn't happening in the same kind of population base that the West was operating in. The West wasn't just different. It was bigger. Way more people. More tracks. More weekly racing. More total engagement. And that matters today, but it mattered back then as well. Because scale was important. Because scale is what mattered for growth, for exposure. Here's the part that gets lost over time. The farther we get away from that history, that lens in time, the easier it becomes to reshape the story, to believe the regurgitated story. Because today, the South, it's booming. It has massive cities. It has massive growth. So when people look back now, it's easy to assume, it was always this way. And that assumption, it makes NASCAR's version of history very easy to believe. Because if you don't understand what the country actually looked like then you can't understand the scale of what already existed out west. And if you don't understand the scale, it becomes easier to believe. NASCAR built something. The reality is, NASCAR was given visitation rights. Because once NASCAR was given access inside Barkheimer and Agajanian system, they realized they didn't need to build one. They were standing in the middle of one. This is the part that gets flipped in history. NASCAR didn't take the West because it was stronger. NASCAR didn't build the West. NASCAR didn't build their sport from Daytona outward. It was given visitation rights, and later, that turned into sole custody. NASCAR needed the West. It needed their infrastructure. It needed their tracks. It needed their competition, their drivers, their stars, their fans. It needed the West's legitimacy. because without that, NASCAR stays what it was, a regional series. The same title they have degraded the Winston West Series with, regional. The West gave NASCAR a pathway to legitimacy. And then came the moment that changes everything. Agajanian was the first to give NASCAR access to a few of his tracks. He was allowed to retain promotional rights, and that's all he wanted. So France was finally in a position. He had access. He had his visitation rights. Once he was inside the system, now that he had access to something he never had before, he had access to scale. There was still one obstacle. The last gatekeeper, Bob Barkheimer. So in 1954, France Jr. arranges a meeting between Barkey and his dad. Barkheimer, he wasn't interested in what France Sr. had to offer. At the time, Barkheimer, his wife Mary, and a friend named Margot Burke were running Pacific Coast Late Models. They were managing the track promotions, races up and down the West Coast. Everything ran through them. But they also had a very young person working for them by the name of Ken Clapp. Here's where the history gets as muddy as the front row at Ascot on a Saturday night. Barkheimer finally agrees with NASCAR that they will get the name Pacific Coast Late Models and access to 10 of his tracks. But Barkheimer will control all the promotional rights and the system and everything else. So his structure was retained. He sold only the name, and NASCAR made him a VP. Barkheimer, he was a kind guy. He had some health issues himself. Matter of fact, later in life, he would go blind. So initially, when NASCAR came in and Barkheimer was made a VP, he has 100% ownership stake still. But what he does, because he's kind, is he gifts his friend Margot Burke 25%. And he gives Ken Clapp 25%. That deal remained in place with Barkey controlling 50% until 1976. It was then that Barkey's wife Mary passed away. And Barkheimer, at that time, made a decision to retire. So it wasn't until 1976 that NASCAR actually took control of the West Coast. So as uncomfortable as it is to say it clearly, history for these decades is encumbered. Before 1971, NASCAR was not the sole authority in American stock car racing. They were a small player in a much larger ecosystem and a landscape controlled by USAC, Agajanian, and Barkheimer. NASCAR stood outside the gates. They begged for entry. They asked if they could eat at the big boy lunch table. Without that permission, NASCAR doesn't survive long enough to become what it is today. That's not opinion. That's factual. That's the record. So when we talk about NASCAR history, we have to stop pretending it began everywhere at once. It was a big conquer. Because before NASCAR controlled the narrative, they had to pass through the gatekeepers. They didn't build the West. They didn't discover the West. They didn't even control it at the stop. They were let in. The foundation wasn't theirs. The access wasn't theirs. So we know there are two sides to every story, but NASCAR made a conscious decision to only tell one. The side that benefited NASCAR and one family the most. So when we talk about NASCAR history, we have to stop pretending it began everywhere at once. Because before NASCAR controlled the narrative, they had to pass through the gatekeepers. NASCAR didn't build the West. They didn't discover the West. They didn't even control it at the start. They were let in. Somewhere along the way, the people who held the keys and let NASCAR in, they got pushed aside. The locks got changed. And if you think this is just about the past, it's not. Because everything we've talked about, it didn't stay in the 50s and the 60s. It carried forward into the modern era. It carried forward into today's record books, into the way we measure greatness in the sport. And that's where the real story begins, because there's a point, a specific point, and it shows up in the modern era and in two words that NASCAR hates to say, because it exposes everything. The modern era is the era where records mattered the most. It's where legacies were defined, where the gaps can't be hidden anymore, where legacy names, where history becomes recorded, tainted, and skewed, where exclusion becomes intentional and malicious, where the gates of history are slammed shut, and where the very pillars that built this sport are left to crumble and disappear. And the money was never guaranteed to land in Daytona. It could have gone somewhere else. And everyone in that room knew it. All of them knew it. On episode 3 of Encumbered, we talk about the two words NASCAR doesn't like to say. Winston and West.